Hey everyone, and welcome back. We are jumping into a really fascinating topic for this deep dive. We're going to be talking about show trials, but not in the way you might immediately think.
Right, yeah. When you hear show trial, you probably think about, historical examples where they were used for political reasons. It wasn't really about justice.
Exactly. And while that's true in many cases historically, the sources we're looking at today ask us to kind of flip the script. What if we took that same energy, that need for people to see accountability, but used it as a force for healing instead?
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think there's something inherently human about that desire to see justice play out, even if it's messy, even if it's imperfect.
And that's what's so interesting about this concept of reimagining show trials through a restorative justice lens. We're not talking about erasing the past or pretending these injustices didn't happen.
Right. It's more about acknowledging the harm, understanding its impact, and then figuring out together how to move forward in a good way.
And a big part of that, it seems, is tackling cases that have gone unaddressed for far too long. Specifically, our sources focus on unsolved racially motivated murders. Cases like, for example, Emmett Till.
Right. The Emmett Till case, just to give folks background if they aren't familiar, is tragic. He was a 14-year-old boy, brutally murdered in 1955. And even though his killers confessed, they were acquitted by an all-white jury.
It's just heartbreaking. And what's even more disheartening is that this isn't just a historical anomaly, right? We continue to see these kinds of miscarriages of justice, these instances where the legal system fails to deliver true justice.
Yeah, and that's where the limitations of traditional justice systems become really clear. They're often just not equipped to deal with the long-term, the generational trauma that something like this inflicts.
Exactly, and that's where this idea of a reimagined show trial comes in, right? It's about creating a space where those deeper harms, those lasting wounds can be addressed.
Exactly, yeah. So imagine, instead of a traditional courtroom, you have this space specifically designed for healing. The focus shifts away from just determining guilt or innocence and more towards understanding the full impact of the crime and then, ideally, finding a path forward together.
So paint me a picture here. What would a reimagined show trial look like? Help me wrap my head around it.
Okay, so think of it as a very structured public forum. It would combine aspects of a traditional trial, like presenting evidence, having different perspectives heard, but the core emphasis wouldn't be on legal technicalities. It'd be on storytelling, truth-telling, and fostering genuine empathy among everyone there.
So are we talking about victims and perpetrators, or in some cases their descendants, sharing their experiences directly?
Right, but, and this is crucial, participation would always be completely voluntary, and the environment would need to be very deliberately curated to make sure it feels safe and supportive. No one should be forced to relive trauma. It's more about creating a space for acknowledgement, for taking responsibility, both individually and as a society.
That element of acknowledgement feels so important, right?
Right.
So before we can even begin to heal, we need to acknowledge that the wound exists, that it mattered.
Exactly. And that's a process, It's about recognizing the harm caused and taking responsibility, both on an individual and on a societal level. And we have to understand that acknowledging something like this, it's not about erasing the past, it's about learning from it so we can hopefully create a better future.
I love that. So walk me through the logistics a little bit. Would a reimagined show trial follow a similar structure to a traditional trial? Would there be opening statements and witness testimonies?
It could, yeah. But the goal, remember, is different. We're not just aiming for a guilty verdict. We're trying to get to a place of shared understanding and healing. So you might have opening statements, but instead of being these adversarial legal arguments, they would center on the human impact of the crime.
So instead of lawyers going back and forth, we would hear directly from the people whose lives were forever changed by this act of violence. That's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and even beyond that, instead of witnesses just stating dry facts, they'd be sharing their stories, their truths, what they experienced. Imagine, in the case of Emmett Till, hearing from his classmates, his friends, his family, hearing firsthand about how one act of hate can ripple outwards and impact an entire community.
I can only begin to imagine the emotions that would come up, the grief, the anger, but hopefully also this sense of shared purpose, of a community coming together to make sure something like this never happens again.
Exactly, and that's really the heart of this approach. It's not just about looking back and assigning blame for the past. It's about proactively creating a better future. It's about acknowledging the harm, understanding the impact, and then doing the work to heal and move forward.
I love it. Okay, so how do we get there? Where do we even begin with something this big?
Well, like with anything complex, the first step is preparation. And in this context, it's not just about logistics, it's about creating a space that can truly hold the weight of the history we're dealing with, all of the emotions.
Okay, so what does that look like in a practical sense?
It has to start by acknowledging that everyone involved is bringing their own emotional and psychological needs to the table. We're talking about trauma, grief, anger, all of it. And so we'd need highly skilled facilitators, people who are trained in trauma-informed practices, people who understand just how complex racial trauma is.
So it's not just about finding people with legal expertise. It's about finding people with empathy, sensitivity, cultural competence, all of that.
Absolutely. We need to create a space where every single person feels safe, respected, and heard. A space where vulnerability is met with compassion, not judgment. Because to really heal, people need to be able to tell their stories, to speak their truths without fear.
So it's about creating a space that feels safe enough to be vulnerable, to be honest, to really dig into those difficult emotions and experiences that have been buried for so long.
Exactly. And that's where the core principles of restorative justice come in. It's not about punishment. It's about repairing harm, building relationships, and working toward a more just and equitable society.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how all of this ties together. So let's dive into those principles of restorative justice a bit deeper. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, and it really comes down to expanding our idea of what justice actually is. It's not just about punishment. It's about healing and accountability and creating a path forward that really honors everyone involved.
And you mentioned truth-telling earlier. That feels like such a core part of this whole thing. But in this setting, it feels like it could be so tricky, right? Uncovering those deeply buried truths. I mean, that could be incredibly painful for the people involved, maybe even re-traumatizing.
Oh, absolutely. Truth-telling can be so difficult. It can even be dangerous if it's not handled carefully. That's why creating that safe and supportive environment is so crucial, like we talked about before. It's not about dragging people back into their trauma and forcing them to relive it. It's about giving them the space to share their experiences, if they choose to, at their own pace.
And just as important as giving people the space to speak those truths is making sure they're heard. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. It can't just be about uncovering facts. It has to be about creating a space where those facts can be spoken and heard without fear, where the emotional truth can be honored.
Right. Because facts, without that emotional context, can feel so empty, you know.
They really can, yeah. And honoring those truths, it can be really powerful. For victims, it can be incredibly validating. For communities, it's a chance to confront their shared history. And in the best case scenario, it becomes this catalyst for broader societal change.
It's like you can't fix something if you're not willing to look at it directly.
So we have this framework, right? We create a safe, structured environment. Restorative justice is the foundation. We prioritize truth-telling, acknowledging what happened, and then we start to focus on healing and moving forward. But how does this actually play out? What's happening in the room during one of these reimagined show trials?
Yeah, give me a picture. Help me see it.
Okay, so imagine it as a series of really focused conversations. They're carefully guided by these skilled facilitators, right? And each conversation is designed to kind of zoom in on a different aspect of the case and its impact. So one of those conversations might be all about personal narratives, right? We're hearing directly from the people who are most affected by the murder of Emmett Till. Family members, friends, community members. They're sharing their stories, their pain, their memories, all of it.
It's amazing just thinking about the power of those voices being given a platform after all these years.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't just be about, like you said, the dry facts of the case. It'd be about the human impact, those ripple effects that one act of violence had.
Yes, exactly. And then another conversation, another round, we might bring in historians and legal experts, folks who can provide more of that historical context, right?
Yeah.
Like with Emmett Till, we'd be diving into the realities of what it was like living in the Jim Crow South, how systemic racism allowed that tragedy to occur, the ways in which the legal system failed Emmett Till and his family. All of those layers.
Wow. Yeah. So we're connecting the dots, right? We're showing how these historical injustices still impact us today.
Yes. And it's not just about looking back. We might have another round that focuses entirely on the present day impact of systemic racism. Bring in some experts on that, community members sharing their lived experiences. How are these issues still showing up in our society?
That's huge. It's like we're saying, this isn't just a story about the past. This is about what's happening right now.
Yes. Connecting the dots between Emmett Till's story and, the ongoing fight for racial justice.
I love it. Okay. So we're having these powerful conversations, but throughout all of it, even with all the weight of what happened, all the emotions, the focus is still on dialogue, on understanding, on finding that common ground.
Yes, exactly. It's a lot to hold, for sure. But that's the goal.
It's ambitious, but man, it feels so necessary, But I have a question about something we haven't really touched on yet. What about accountability? Where does that fit into all of this?
Oh, it's a huge part of it. But again, it's not as simple as just saying, okay, who do we punish? It's about taking responsibility for your actions, making amends to those who were harmed, and then really committing to doing better in the future.
So, practically speaking, what might that look like?
It could take so many different forms. It's really going to depend on the specifics of the case, right? But some possibilities, and again, these aren't the only ones, we could have a formal apology from anyone who is involved. Or community service projects, something that directly addresses the harm that was caused. Financial restitution to the victims' families, things like that.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's about finding ways to address the harm in a way that feels appropriate and meaningful.
Yes, exactly. And also understanding that accountability, it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. And that process involves all of us committing to dismantle systemic racism and build a more just and equitable society.
It's not just about making things right in this one instance. It's about creating a world where hopefully this doesn't happen again, at least not in the same way.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Which brings us to another really interesting piece of this whole puzzle, the audience. Because remember, in this setting, they aren't just passive observers. They are active participants, almost like a jury. But instead of deciding guilt or innocence, they're tasked with considering everything they've heard and then deliberating on a path forward.
Wow, so their role is much bigger than in a traditional courtroom.
Right. It's way more complex than just guilty or not guilty.
Yeah. What an incredible task and an incredible responsibility.
Right. It's challenging, for sure. They need not just that basic legal knowledge, but also, like we've been talking about, empathy, compassion, and a really solid understanding of the complexities of racial injustice.
It sounds like, in a way, we're asking a lot of the audience, but in the best way possible. Like we're saying, we need your help to figure this out. We need your hearts and minds to move forward.
Yes. And that's because the end goal, the hope, is that these reimagined show trials don't just address this one act of injustice. It creates ripple effects. That this helps create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
So it's about so much more than just the past. It's about the future we build from here.
Yes, exactly. And that brings us to the big question, right? The show trial ends, the conversations are over. What happens next? What does that future look like?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Like, we've been talking about this incredible space we can create, the healing, the understanding, the potential for accountability. But then, the trial ends. How do we make sure all of that doesn't just disappear when everybody leaves the room?
That's such a good point. We have to be really careful about that because, as powerful as this idea is, a reimagined show trial isn't some, magic solution, right? It's more it's a starting point. It gets the ball rolling, hopefully towards bigger changes.
So it's not enough to just talk the talk. We got to walk the walk afterwards, too.
100%. That's where the real work begins. Putting these principles into action, taking those conversations, those uncomfortable truths, and making sure they fuel real, tangible change in our communities, our institutions, our everyday lives.
So what does that look like? Give me some examples. How do we take it beyond just the conversations?
Okay, so one powerful way, I think, to honor Emmett Till's legacy, the legacy of all those who have been victims of racial violence, is education. What if we created educational programs for schools, for communities that actually taught the truth about our history, the good and the bad?
Yeah, it feels like so often with history, people want to just gloss over the messy parts,
Yeah.
But you're saying, no, those parts are crucial for us to learn from, right?
Right. If we're going to try to dismantle systemic racism, we can't pretend it doesn't exist. We need to understand how we got here, how did it become so embedded in our society. But it's not just about the past either.
Oh, right. It has to connect to what's happening right now.
Yeah, exactly. We have to make it crystal clear that these issues we're facing today, like police brutality, mass incarceration, the racial wealth gap, those are all connected to these historical injustices.
It's like we're drawing a line straight from Emmett Till to, the front page of the newspaper today.
Exactly. Because if people don't understand that those are all part of the same story, they're going to keep treating them like isolated incidents.
Right. Like it's a one-time thing, when really it's been happening for centuries.
Exactly. So education is huge. And then alongside that, we need real concrete policy reform.
Oh, yeah. That feels big. Where do we even start?
Well, we got to take a hard look at our laws, our institutions, the policies we have in place. And we got to ask, Are these upholding justice? Are they creating equal opportunity for everybody? Or are they actually perpetuating these cycles of injustice?
So like stuff like sentencing guidelines for drug offenses, which we know disproportionately impact Black and brown communities, or redlining practices that created these segregated neighborhoods, which then contributed to the racial wealth gap.
Yeah, all of that. It's about identifying the specific systems that are perpetuating this inequality and either dismantling them or radically changing them, or rebuilding them on a foundation of justice and fairness.
This feels huge. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think like, okay, these are such massive issues. How do we even begin to tackle them?
It's a good question. And honestly, it starts with something that can feel really small, but it makes a difference. Believing that change is possible. And then from that belief, understanding that even small acts of resistance can have a ripple effect.
Okay, I like that. So what would that look like? Give me an example.
It can be as simple as having those hard conversations with your family, your friends, your community. It's about actively educating yourself, staying informed about the issues, and holding our elected officials accountable.
So it's both, right? It's the individual stuff, but then also coming together as a community to demand change on a bigger level.
Exactly. Because that's where the power of like this whole reimagined show trial thing, that's where it can really shine. Because it's not just about holding individuals accountable. It's about that energy, that collective energy of a whole community saying, we want justice, we demand better.
It's like we're taking all that emotion, the anger, the grief even, and channeling it into something positive, something that can hopefully create lasting change.
Yes. And remembering this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. We will hit roadblocks, people will resist, but giving up is not an option. We owe it to Emmett Till, to everyone who's been silenced and marginalized, to keep fighting for that world where justice and equality aren't just words, they're a reality.
That's beautiful. And on that note, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
You know, for me, it always comes back to that transformative power. It's this idea of reimagining show trials through a restorative justice lens. It's not just about changing individual hearts and minds. It's about transforming entire communities. And it reminds us that justice, it's not passive. It's not something we get to just sit back and watch. It demands that we show up, we listen, we learn, and most importantly, that we act.
I love that. It's a call to action for all of us to take what we've learned here today and let it fuel our own journeys toward justice. And with that, thank you all so much for joining us for this incredibly powerful and important deep dive. We'll see you next time.